Control, this is Agent Ogren. I need a request to open up cell 311.
FreeMe Podcast.
Good afternoon. This is Thomas with FreeMe Podcast. Today we're with Dr. Robert Rhoton. He is the founder of the Arizona Trauma Institute. How are you doing today, Doctor?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thank you.
So you're out in Arizona. How did you come about founding this Arizona Trauma Institute?
Part of that is really just my own curiosity about trauma and the beginnings of learning how to work with it, and then realizing that a lot of the people that are professionals don't know how to work with it. A lot of times people get trained in a model of treatment and will try to apply that to everybody that they work with without understanding that each person's unique trauma history means that you have to approach them uniquely. And so I became kind of dissatisfied with what was out there and began to teach people how to do this. I was teaching college at the time, and I began with some of my graduate students. And when I retired from the university, I'd been kind of doing this on the side for, 6-7 years. And the demand was so much that we essentially, when I retired, it was one person, it was me and a part-time receptionist person. And now we have close to 18 people, and we operate courses, and we have learners in 138 countries, and we train approximately 25,000 people a year. So you would think with all of that you'd make a bigger dent in the mental health world, but that's just the system is very slow to change. So that's what we work on, is trying to educate people on how to work with trauma more effectively, and how to stop looking at what is natural responses as being pathology or bad behavior, or and the list goes on and on. So that's, for me, it was just dissatisfaction with what was available.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that mental health is not a priority in this country?
It is a priority, but how to do it well isn't a priority. The economic structure, and if you want to think of it as a medical and pharmaceutical industrial complex, stand to lose billions of dollars if the system changes. And so there is no impetus on their part to have it actually be working for the good of the client. All of these programs are designed for the good of the mental health field. And so, you go to a psychiatrist, and their job is to give you medication. And rather than teach you how to manage what's going on, they give you medication. When you go to a therapist, to begin to get treatment, you have to prove you're sick enough to be worthy to be treated. They do that in their intake process. And then they focus on how you're damaged and broken. And, the simple law of the way the brain and nervous system works, what you focus on, you get more of. And so we have these people that go into, they're vulnerable, they want help, and they are continually focused on what isn't working, and they do more of it. And then people are surprised. And then we begin to label the client, they're resistant, or they're non-compliant, or they're in denial, or the list of negative labels is huge. And really, basically what they're saying is that it's their fault that they're having these symptoms. And that system, the way it's designed, supports the economic infrastructure of medicine, psychiatry, and mental health. And it doesn't really focus on wellness for the individual.
Well, that's well said. And I guess that's how I've always been, because I've had a lifetime of trauma, and it's led me down a dark, dark road. And it took me many years into my adulthood to really start to figure out what was going on inside my own brain. And I've never been one to, even as a child, I've just never been one to take medication, you know, because I've always looked at medication as just a Band-Aid. You know, I always wanted to know how to fix the problem so I didn't have to take medication. You know, and I guess in my early 20s, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And again, I tried taking, you know, I was on Ritalin as a child. Then they put me on Prozac for a little while, you know, and the effects that it just altered me. You know, I just didn't feel human in a sense, you know, and I just didn't want that. And that started me on my cycle to try to just figure out what my triggers were, how to calm my anxiety, you know, just these skills, you know. Is this what you try to implement in your courses?
Well, I try to teach people the basic science of what's going on, you know, why the body's operating the way it is, and to help them understand that this isn't bad behavior. It isn't mental illness. It is the way the body's designed to work. And if you want to help somebody, you have to work with the way the body works. You can't demand that they do something that they really aren't equipped to do. And a lot of the mental health approaches really don't do a good job of that.
Well, I think us as human beings, like when I try to teach somebody something, I'm trying to teach them how I learned, but that specific person does not learn that way. So how do we teach? How do we learn a person and how they learn? Like what signs, how does that even work?
Well, I think before you can even do that, you have to understand what's going on. You know, for when we start working with folks, not only clients, but when we start to train people, we really start with some very basic things. Our nervous system is running the show. Our nervous system is the foundation of all thought, all sensation, all emotion, all movement, all action requires the use of that nervous system. And our nervous system strives to make everything work in unity, and trauma basically interferes with that ability to create that unity. And we all often are looking at the nervous system responses, and we give them labels, but most of the responses are exactly what should be happening with what's going on in the brain and the nervous system. And so it becomes kind of a challenge for us, because if you're really looking at trauma, the way we define trauma in so much of the literature is we talk about this big bad event. But most people that have a big bad event are never going to go to therapy for it, because they work through it quite well all on their own. The thing that is incredibly unfortunate is that we tend, because our focus, and this is what mental health has done, is this focused on this single event distracts everybody from understanding that it is daily toxic stress, repeated adversity, and environment that is driving arousal in this body. And the experiences that people are having are related to what's going on in here. But if they don't understand that, then what they do, and I see this in graduate programs all over the country, is we train people to analyze a situation based on the symptoms rather than understanding that the symptoms are actually correct. And what you really need to be doing is focusing on how can I help change this environment. So that becomes kind of a challenge. And, we don't want to, on this program, we don't want to go into all of the neurochemicals involved, but some of them, most people are kind of familiar with some of them. But the reality is all of the biochemical and hormonal activity is creating neural connections in the brain and nervous system. In other words, because our nervous system is reacting to our environment, we're actually building connections that are now physical structures in the brain and nervous system. And once those structures are formed, we operate on them automatically. We're not we're not evaluating them. We're operating them on
Muscle
those
memory.
just, well, it's like muscle memory. We call it procedural memory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, all sorts of things. Which sock do you put on first? Which shoe do you tie first? When you have something on your plate, which do what do you do first? Pick up your spoon, pick up your fork. We have all of these patterns that we build from repetitive experience, but it isn't necessarily just the repetitive experience that's happening, but it is what's happening in that nervous system. So you have a kid that is living in an environment where the stress level is high, not abused, not hit, not deprived of food, but they're ignored, or they're treated like they're unimportant, and they can't connect with their parents. And the stress of that early on begins to build patterns of how to operate, how to hold your body, how to think, how to emote, how to connect with people. And so you have, in a same family, you can have multiple presentations of this, because each kid's going to adapt to the environment in a unique way. Maybe the oldest child is the anxious, perfectionistic overachiever trying to earn connection, and value with the parents. Another child might be so distressed by this that they'll do anything to not feel any kind of arousal. And so they become kind of overly involved in reading or video games, or as they approach teenage years, they can't tolerate that kind of distress in their body at all. And so they look for things to distract the body, or to mitigate that possibility of arousal. So they will do things like, compulsive behaviors, or they will use drugs. And what we tend to do is punish the use of drugs and punish the use of compulsive behaviors, rather than how do we stabilize this environment so the child's body isn't in this constant state of arousal? Because until we can get them regulated, we can't possibly help them learn differently. That probably was an overlong answer.
No, I mean, Dr. Bob, that's the premise of my whole show, right? Is trying to bring awareness to young parents how detrimental they are to their children without even realizing it. And It's like you said, it's not these traumatic events of the husband beating the wife or anything like that. It's just tension in the house that the child, that's not explained to the child. It's like I say, back in the days, the elder used to take the child out for his first hunt, and the hunt itself was a traumatic experience, right? The kill was a traumatic experience for the child. But when the elder sat down and he explained to the child, this is why we hunt. This animal feeds the tribe. We bless the animal, all of these things. It subdues that trauma, because now that the child is able to process why this happened, and he understands it and he agrees with it eternally. But with today, because of economical pressures and social norms and all of these distractions that are around us all day constantly, as adults, we don't have time to put these explanations into our children. So when an event like a global pandemic, go ahead.
Well, I it's not that we don't have time. It is that we have adults that aren't regulated themselves well enough. They aren't meeting their own needs well enough to meet anybody else's.
Yeah,
so
we do have the time. We're just proportionally, appropriately differently. Yeah,
you get parents that are getting into relationships, getting out of relationships. You have no real intentionality. It's all reactivity. And so they're ill-equipped and they're not mature enough quite often. And so what we end up doing is seeing this intergenerational transmission of toxic stress environments. And because the parent is never fully matured in their own life. They don't regulate themselves. They're not operating in their executive functioning system. Everything, and our society promotes that. The first question is, well, how do you feel about that? Well, when did emotions become the dominant thing? You're going to feel bad about a lot of things that you need to do in life, and that doesn't mean you don't do them. You're going to have a lot of challenges. I don't feel like doing it is not an answer. And what we have built is, in the last 50 years, is a society that's really over-focused on emotion instead of understanding that when you are in your executive functioning system, you make a choice and act on that and follow through on that because you're doing it intentionally. And until you can get into that part of the brain and stay in it for the most of the time, you can't grow intentionally very well. You're not going to sustain changes you make very well. And our system doesn't really support mature, responsible parenting because for any number of reasons. And then because parents aren't able to regulate themselves, they're all about them and what they're experiencing rather than what the child is experiencing. And so they tend to focus everything. It's, look at how many, and I'm don't mean this to be critical, but it's just a clear evidence. A man or a woman, depending on whichever parent you're with, starts dating and they want to sleep with this person. And so you're supposed to like them and you're supposed to get along with them. Why? Because your parent wants to sleep with them. You're supposed to accept them into your life. Well, that doesn't work out. So they're on to somebody else and they're on to somebody else and they're on to somebody else. What does the child learn from that is that relationships are not permanent, that they're to meet sexual gratification and they have no other purpose, and that the child has no rights to like or not like whoever comes into their life. Well, those are horrible messages to leave a child.
Now, what about when that woman is allowing these men to come into their home and beat on her in front of the child, men after men after men?
That's also there's messages. Not only is there constant tension, but this is how you behave with somebody. And, these are patterns that are built early in life. And then once the pattern is built, we're not looking for, well, why am I thinking this way? It just becomes automatic. And there's a lack of understanding of what's really going on. A simple little one. When the body moves into that aroused state, there's about 100 changes that occur in our perception. One of the first and most prominent is the musculature of the middle ear constricts. And when the musculature of the middle ear constricts, a person can't process language very well. They're looking for danger sounds and not information. And that's the way the survival system works in the body.
When the adrenaline kicks in.
Well, yeah, there's a whole host of things, but yeah, but that's so that happens, and so think of whether you're in a disagreement with a spouse or a friend, or you're angry at a child, or you're trying to get the child to hear something. Nobody can hear and process language well when they're in that state. And if the person is angry and trying to have a conversation with somebody, then you hear things like this from parents. Well, I've told them this 50 times and they just don't get it. Well, of course not, because when you're having the conversation, they can't hear you. And, that's not an intentionality. They're not failing to hear you because they are obstinate or stubborn, but they are not able to do it biologically.
They're practically in shock. Their body is shut down,
Yeah. We also know that people that are raised in kind of chronic toxic stress environments, as children, often manifest the symptoms of ADHD. But the reality is they don't have ADHD. Their body's in a state of arousal, and it's doing exactly what the body should be doing. It's not focusing. It doesn't process language very well. It can't learn very well. It can't learn very well because the part of the brain that's being flooded, the chemicals being released, cortisol and adrenaline, interfere with sequential memory. So you can't remember very well. Your danger system is saying you need to be checking the environment constantly, so you don't pay attention to anything. Your attention's all over the place. If you're a person that tries to calm through connecting to people, you're going to overtalk. You're going to talk, and the more stress the teacher or anybody else puts on you, the more you're going to want to talk, which is going to get you in trouble. And so, we know if it's truly an organic issue, that it should emerge in any population about 2% of the time. The fact that we have almost 40% of the school-age children diagnosed as ADHD is proof that there are a lot of toxic child-rearing environments out there.
40% of children are diagnosed with ADHD.
About that.
I did not know that.
And really, it can't be more than 1.5 to 2%. If you understand how genetics and biology work, cancer stays at right about that same. Schizophrenia, we've been doing research on schizophrenia for 60 years, and it stays right about 1.5 to 2% of a population. But when you have socially driven symptoms that we've labeled like ADHD, we have massive numbers. In some of the school systems that I've done some consulting work with, they have 13 to 15% of the kids diagnosed as bipolar. And, but nobody's looking at what's going on in their home.
That's staggering, man.
It is. You figure that the average teenager meets all the criteria for major depression at least once during their adolescence, and it's almost all relational. So we are not a good environment for children in the United States.
Well, I mean, that's a segue into some statistics that I want to read off to you, because again, like I say, the premise of my show is just to raise awareness on these stats, man. I mean, it's disgusting to me. So as of January 16th, 2020, 1 out of 100 people in the United States are incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
Juveniles at 12 years old, 545. At 13 years old, 1,429. At 14, almost 4,000. 15, 7,500. 16, 11,000. 17, 12,000. That was in 2017. It's unremarkable that we had that's almost 50,000 children we have incarcerated in our country. Mm-hmm. Knowing those kind of statistics, what effect do you think that's going to have on our future as a country?
Well, I think the incarceration is the frustration of a society in knowing, because they're trying to approach the problem from the wrong place. What we're doing is taking the person that is having these behaviors and we're punishing them for having these behaviors. In other words, we're actually punishing them because their body is operating the way it is. And we don't like it, so they shouldn't do it. Instead of where we need to be focusing the attention is really changing culture. And, what are we doing to build infrastructure so people are employed and can support families and can, what are we doing to help families build, cohesiveness and to help parents calm down and help parents be able to be more effective? We're not investing in that. Mm-hmm. We are cleaning up the mess afterwards. And I've worked with juveniles.
Delaying the stimulus past Christmas time definitely ain't helping with the stress of the American people. I could tell you that.
No. But what you run into is that, and nobody really talks about this statistic, and I don't know that anybody really collects it, but you probably have a percentage, and I'm going to guess it's probably 5 or 6%, and that's just anecdotal based on my experience. But you have 5 or 6% of the kids that would rather be in detention than be home, because there's more structure and less tension in jail than there is in their household. And that is a horrible situation. And what are we doing to address that? You know, what do we do when we know families are having problems? Child Protective Services come in and they remove the child. And quite often those children are more traumatized in the system than they were in the home that they were in. And they put all these demands on this very dysregulated parent or parents. And then when the parent can't comply because there's just so much more stress now than there was before, and they weren't managing that well. So when they don't comply, then the governmental bodies say, well, they don't really love their children. Well, that's just BS. Is that what are you doing to help the parents be stable? What are you doing to help the parents regulate their own emotions so they have the wherewithal to help these children and to be more effective as parents?
Well, going back into what you were discussing earlier, do you think that's even their agenda though? How do we overcome? No. So how do we overcome that as a community? You know, as you and I, as parents, and as a community, as Americans, knowing that we're fighting against a political agenda, how do we overcome that?
Most of it is going to require us to just have a whole different mindset on how we see community. Many of the people in America don't even know their neighbors. They don't know what their neighbors are experiencing. So how are you ever going to help somebody else stay? Almost everybody, there's in the New Yorker magazine, I think it was the second year it was published, it was during an election year, and it shows this 2-panel black and white kind of cartoon of a politician. You know how they used to make him look kind of piggish with a big cigar. Yeah. And he's asking his audience how many think there needs to be change, and everybody's hand is up. And in the next panel it says who's willing to change, and nobody's hand's going up. And that's everybody who wants somebody else to do something to make it different. The real truth is that we have to decide to make it different. You know, what are we doing? And it doesn't take big things. It just takes consistent things. I'll give you a silly example. Being in a grocery line, and there's a mother that has 3 small children, and they're all melting down, and she's trying to get through the line. Look around and see how many people are judging the mother because these children are acting up. Well, the children are not regulating. Mom's not going to be able to regulate. And the judgment from other people just makes the dysregulation higher. And a lot of times it's just really something simple you can do, like just step forward and say, hey, can I help with the kids? Is there anything I can do to help you? You know, I understand this is really kind of, they're tired and these are going on. A little bit of compassion applied on a regular basis really helps people calm down. I was in what state was I in? I don't remember what state I was in, but I went into one of the stores, and I just picked up something small, and the person, held out their hand for the money, and I put the money in their hand, and they started to tear up. And I said, what's going on? She said, you're the first person that's touched me all day. Most people just throw their money on the counter. And you actually have been looking at me and talking to me, and you actually touched me. Well, how much is your system so overwhelmed that is a meaningful thing?
Well, that tells you how out of touch we are, right? And sure. and this is a lesson that I had taught, somebody not too long ago. You know, I noticed that when I talk to telemarketers, or if I call like a customer service agent or something like that, you know, just by me asking them before I even start into my gripe or my complaint or whatever it is that I'm calling this other human being about, just me asking them, you know, how are you doing today? How's your day going? Like it overwhelms, like you say, it overwhelms this person, you know, because they're just used to somebody just yelling at them and coming in without even just asking this person, you know, this human being, how their day is going.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think that's agenda, you know, and now with COVID, and then with IT the way that it is, we're going to be hermits, you know, everybody basically being in their house for a year, you know, social distancing for the past year. It's scary. It really is.
And that's one of the reasons I think you're seeing a lot of adolescent suicides. In the numbers are increasing quite a bit. They feel isolated, and they're not getting the connections that they need, and they're not getting them from their friends, which is where they've gotten them before. They're definitely not getting them from their parents. If you have dysregulated parents that are all over the place and they're stressed in their life, and then you are locked up with them all day long, yeah, that's a recipe for some serious problems.
You know, I recently saw a documentary by I think his name was Sir Trevor McDonald, and he went in Indiana State Prison, and he interviewed a gentleman in there. His name was Ronald L. Sanford. And Ronald Sanford committed a double homicide at the age of 13 years old. Mm-hmm. Him and another guy. The other kid was 15 years old. Their plan was to, the Indiana State Fair, they wanted to go to the fair. So they were going to mow lawns in order to raise money to go to the fair. The first house they went to was an elderly lady. They went, knocked on the door. Lady, long story short, the lady did not want her lawn cut. So the two boys pushed their way up into the home, stabbed the old lady, waited for her sister to come home, stabbed and killed her, netted $5 out of it. So only one boy ended up going to the fair. And all the attention got turned on the 13-year-old. The 15-year-old ended up turning state's evidence right away, put all the blame on the 13-year-old. He didn't do any time. The 13-year-old got life. How do you feel about that?
I don't think any minor should be getting life in prison, because almost all the time, what there is, the basic assumption that we see applied over and over again is that the child had a plan and they did this with intention. And most crime is not done with a clear plan. It's mostly opportunistic. You know, kids walking down a sidewalk and they see something in the front seat of a car that they want. They didn't have that plan when they left their house. It's just opportunistic. And so for intentionality to occur, you have to be in that part of your brain that's intentional. And that's clearly, does he need to be punished for the behavior that they did? Well, yeah, but life imprisonment for a child before they even have a life to really be taken away. I mean, it's really, I find that prosecuting most adolescents as an adult is a horrific thing, but it's not about justice. It's about, do we get to feel good because we've punished somebody? We do not have a recovery or a reclamation, if you will, attitude towards people that get into trouble. Even though we recognize, you know, you look at in a typical jail, You have a good portion are there for drug violations, and almost all of them use whenever they can because they don't like the state that they are experiencing when they're not using. Why aren't we addressing that state that they're in rather than trying to punish them for their behavior? We yell at children for not paying attention, but their arousal system is so high that they can't pay attention. We see people that are dysregulated and engage in opportunistic behavior, and we want to punish them for the behavior with the idea that's really going to help. But what would really help is helping them be able to stay in that part of their conscious brain that would allow them to make decisions. Silly one like this. I had a dad tell me, he's talking about his 3-year-old, that this 3-year-old just does stuff to piss him off. And I said, wait a minute, are you telling me that your child gets up in the middle of the night and makes a plan? How can I really torment dad tomorrow? And he goes, well, no, that's stupid. But the way you're talking about it, because you're annoyed, you are saying he's doing that on purpose. It's not his failure to regulate. It's your failure to regulate. You're getting aroused because of what he's doing, so you want to blame him.
And that's the society we're in today. We're in a society where it's do as I say, not as I do, and blame everything society, everything just so that I don't have to look at myself, and this is scaring me because I see what's going on in Canada. They're actually trying to make it a crime, right? To call somebody a name, to be offensive, and I just don't like where I see us going.
Well, and it's part of it is that, again, it's kind of a global failure to understand what's going on in the body of a person. We respond to what's going on in our system. If I have a lot of unmet needs, my body is in survival mode. And so I'm not intentional. I'm trying to meet a need, and I'll meet it in whatever way I can. And that's, and when we have kids that are being raised in environments of stress, they just cannot think clearly. A lot of times when I am talking about this with groups of parents, I will talk about, so the genius part of your brain, I call it the Bruce Banner part. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to correct children, and you're trying to get lessons learned when they are in the Hulk mode. Mm-hmm. Or if you like, if you want to think Einstein, Frankenstein, when they're in the Hulk, they're not behaving badly. They're behaving organically correctly. They are behaving in biologically correct ways. You shouldn't be punishing people for behaving in biologically correct ways. Essentially, what you're saying is you're a bad person because you're a human being. And that's a horrific message to give people. So, it doesn't just apply to something simple like that. You have a kid that is spent the whole weekend at home getting stressed and being maybe ignored or maybe ridiculed or teased or put down. No physical assaults, no physical abuse, no sexual abuse, but just constantly being irritated. They've been in their Hulk system all weekend, and they go to school and Monday morning, and they're supposed to sit still, pay attention, and do what the teacher says. But their body is still in that arousal state. And one of the reasons that people don't want to look at this stuff, I think, often is because the way the body works, I can be able to be pretty cognitive in about 20 minutes, 30 minutes after I've had an arousing period. But my body takes upwards of, depending on my history, anywhere from 6 to 30 hours to metabolize those chemicals in the body. And so while I may appear like I'm able to talk to you clearly, my body is still churning up with this stuff. And so the next thing that happens can be tiny, but it's just enough to bring me back up to full speed again. And so you need time to get that body relaxed, or you need to actually do things to help the body relax. So when we go in and work with schools, we talk about, look, if that kid comes into your room and he is in a state of arousal, you need to do several things. One, you need to recognize it. Two, you need to keep you calm in the face of that arousal, because if you move into a power struggle with somebody, or if you're trying to correct them when they're in Hulk mode, how well is that going to work? I mean, I don't know if you're a Marvel comic fan, but telling Hulk that he should calm down isn't going to work. Telling Hulk that he should not do something, the Hulk is a creature of instinct and survival. And that's what you're dealing with. So why we don't teach that to teachers? We teach them to punish, and all they're really interested in is compliance and acquiescence. And when they can't get that, then they get mad at the kids. Well, if you've got a kid that's already aroused and they're sitting there and they're doing their best, but their body is just blowing them up, a teacher can either blow it up more or help.
It sounds like a big hamster wheel to me, and it all revolves all back to just governmental pressures, that we have on us, and it's like how you said earlier, when I said that we don't have time as parents because, we're working, and you said it so well, that we do have time. We're just choosing to spend our time in other ways than what the priority should be, which is our children. At the end of the day, if as you say, me and the wife, we spent all weekend, arguing over bills or whatever. It may be minute to her and I, but it's traumatic to our child. And we have to recognize that. We have to recognize, even though that we know that her and I was just frustrated and we were just raising our voices, the child does not know that. And the child is sitting up in the room like, I've never heard mommy and daddy talk to each other like this. The child does not understand bills. So how do we as parents recognize traumatic events that are happening to our children that we just write off as everyday life?
Well, part of this is, and I don't think governments can do anything to change this, to be honest with you.
Well, it all boils down to self.
It really requires maturity on the part of adults.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the ACE studies?
No.
The Adversity of Childhood Experience studies?
Mm-mm.
So in the mid-90s, we discovered through a massive piece of research that there are common factors that create trauma. And, certainly child sexual abuse, physical abuse and neglect, emotional and physical neglect, witnessing domestic violence are some of those. But the rest were all family dysfunction. And if you had 3 or 4 of these, you were at risk of having a 20-year less lifespan because your body builds those patterns early in life. And Vince Folletti, who's the primary investigator of that, and I were speaking at a conference a couple of years ago, and somebody in the audience said, well, if you had to summarize the ACE study in one statement, what would it be? And Vince said, without even dropping a beat, the ACE study is massive evidence of the failure of parenting, because you have parents that are not regulating themselves. Because we want to talk in terms of choice. Well, the parent's choosing not to do something. No, you only have choice when you're in Bruce Banner mode.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in Hulk mode, you're in reaction mode. And
how do you know when you're in either one?
Well, first of all, you have to get that system calmed down well enough to recognize when your body's shifting. You recognize when your body is shifting. How many times have you noticed your breath is changing, your breath volume is changing, your heartbeat is changing, your muscle tension is changing? But we aren't aware of that. We're like,
but Dr. Bob, what about the person that's in like as we said earlier, a perpetual state of just excitement and trauma all day from the moment they wake
Yep.
up to the moment they go to sleep is anger and aggravation and argument all day.
So the question is, who's in charge of that environment?
Well, it's not the person.
That's right. The people that have to make the initial changes are the people in charge of the environment.
Which is yourself. And that's why I say it all comes down to self.
Yeah. And well, it is the self, except biologically. I mean, I don't care what human development book you look at, children are not designed to be self-regulating.
No.
They are designed to be regulated in response to a connected relationship. In order to have good connected relationships, the adult must be able to stay in Bruce Banner mode. If the adult cannot do that, they cannot help the child.
When that's a great point, because my wife and I, we had a discussion the other day about whether children have personalities or whether they're just mimicking their environment. You know, for me, I just say that children mimic what their environment is, you know, and to a certain degree, to a certain point, to where they start to form their own personality, 14, 15, you know, young adolescents, when they go into that switch. But she claims that she had a personality of her own at 5 years old. So,
well, I'm going to probably take a different tack with you. Each body has its own sensitivity. So, where I have, you know, where somebody can be born in the same family, and this person is more reactive to cortisol than their brother or sister is, and this one's more reactive to catecholamine, and so when the same event is happening, it is interpreted biochemically differently for each person. And so the patterns that are built that we tend to think of as being, you know, a lot of personality are being built by those unique sensitivities. And so all of us come with a design, if you will, that is either going to be uncovered and built, or it's going to be overran by what we're experiencing. But your parents are, you know, that caregiving environment, whatever it is the part that should bring out the attributes of this personality. The reality is that a lot of what's happening is that children are having to smother those natural parts of themselves because of the environment that they're in. You know, the child that would normally love to engage in with adults and want to be connected and want to talk and be around them, but because of the dysregulation of the parent, for example, they've learned to associate a certain car door slam with a drunk parent, and so they would like to be able to meet that parent and have a good time and connect with them when they come home. But that car door means it's unsafe. And so now they they hear that door sound, their body shifts chemistry, and they run to their room and hide. Or they gear up for a fight to get that engagement that they need. But they are not responding through a rational decision making. It is a reactive process. They've moved out of any kind of executive functioning. And children are not designed to be able to regulate themselves. You know, I have a lot of folks that will say, well, when should a child be able to regulate themselves? And I say, well, when do you think? And they say, well, around 3 or 4. I said, no, a child shouldn't be able to really regulate themselves consistently until somewhere between 11 and 13. And that is if they have lived in and been raised in an environment that has been pretty well regulated. If the environment hasn't been well regulated, we're going to push that time frame back, maybe even a decade. And
what about a tumultuous one?
Well, yeah, you can't expect a child to be well regulated when they're living in that environment. funny. I had a couple of teachers say, well, look, this kid has been raised in this environment, and they're good students, and they're very meticulous, and they're very perfectionistic in what they do. And yeah, that's right, because that's how they've adapted. Is there's such chaos around them, the only way they can feel safe is to put order to everything. And that may work really well academically, and it may work really well career-wise, but it's going to play hell with their relationships.
So as an adult parent, say a single mother or a single father or however, how do you spot or recognize if a child is displaying some sort of trauma?
Well, you'll see all of those. You'll see all their reactions of arousal. The first place isn't to notice it in the child. The first place is to notice it in the adult. When am I shifting into an aroused state? Is my body reacting to tension and stress? If I can't relax it, I can't help a child relax. And so we always want the kid to be able to do stuff, but the kid, again, they are not wired to be able to do this. They're only wired to do it in response to a regulated adult. And until they have lots of experiences of co-regulating with that adult, they can't do that for themselves. When they get to be in their mid-20s, they can, but it really requires a lot of work.
So I guess what age would you say that the child starts forming their own personality? They're making their own decisions, and as a parent,
let's speak. Personality has nothing to do with our decision making.
How so?
Personality is really our manifest of our process of how we are digesting experience.
Well, true. That's the expression of what our experiences through life has been.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that not factor into our decisions?
Well, because decision making is the way we talk about decision making in our society assumes that people have thought things through and they're making an active choice. Most of the time for children, they are not making an active choice. They're making a reactive choice because the system that they're in isn't that logic system.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not to be difficult, but I'm trying to be really careful about the decision-making piece, because so many people say, well, they decided to do that. Well, they only decided if they are in if they're in Bruce Banner mode. If they're in Hulk mode, they're reactive.
So a conscious person is right, living through decisions, but a reactive emotional person
isn't,
which is most of our people today. And
that's
again,
right.
this is what I bring out in a lot of my shows, and I've led a life of emotional decisions. I know the outcome of what making emotional decisions are, and what that is a lot of, I wish I would have thought that through more clearly, and
it's a lot of chaos.
Man, let me tell you, who you telling? A lot of chaos, and I'm tired. And this is the thing. This is what I'm trying to teach my daughter now. Like, put all the hard work in now, because your body structure is designed for this hard work now. Mm-hmm. Because at 45, it's not, I played when I should have been working hard. And now I have to work hard when I should be playing,
That's the nature of our learning cycle, apparently. That's, most of us, if you grew up with any kind of with stress or trauma, you're just looking for things to kind of fill up the holes in your soul.
Well, as you were saying earlier, for me, coming home from school, my first temperature check was, if the house was silent and nobody was talking, I knew that my father was in a rage, and for me just to go to my room and not make no noise, no distractions. That was as soon as I opened the door, I did a temperature check of the house. If people were moving around, I knew that my father was calm, everything was okay, you know. And I learned at a very, very young age how to read bodies, how to read people's expressions, their bodies, and gauge.
It was a survival strategy for you.
It was, and it grew into something, useful today, but it was very traumatic. It was a very, very traumatic time all the way through. So,
Sure.
To sum this up, go ahead.
So it's the environment begins to change the neurochemistry and the neurochemicals and hormones in the body as early as the second trimester. Well,
let me ask you this, coming from somebody whose mother was 8 months jumping off the chair trying to induce labor because she was just tired of being pregnant. How does that affect a child in the womb?
Well, remember, any of the chemistry that's going on in your parent is coming into you as well. So if there's a lot of stress hormones, you're the lucky recipient of that. So yeah, which will affect how you view the world. There was a really interesting study that was done in the early 90s by a guy named Martin Teacher out of Boston's McLean Hospital. It was in the early days of brain imaging research. And they proposed that if you exposed a pregnant primate to daily levels of moderate stress, and they define it pretty well, that the offspring would be born with more mass and volume in the part of the brain that is that Hulk part, the paralimbic, the reactive survival system. And so they did this study, and what they found was that those offspring that were born from the stressed parent had more mass and volume, sometimes as much as 2 deviations higher than the control group. And that was amazing. And everybody's like, well, that's what we expected. But there's a message there, and there's actually 2 messages. Let me make this one. That what the fetus was experienced because of stress in the mother was changing the way their brain worked, was changing their sensitivity to certain hormonal and biochemical changes in their own body.
So is this how you quote unquote are born evil?
Well, I don't believe in being born evil. I think that's just,
I don't either personally, but
the other piece of that is that as they continue to study those offspring, when those offspring reproduced in non-stressful environments, that was handed down to their offspring. And it took several generations of offspring to remediate the original change.
Several generations.
Several. So we don't like thinking about that because that's way forward focused in our society. But what kids are experiencing even prenatally can show up not only in their own life, but it can show up in the lives of their grandchildren. And that is a really unfortunate legacy that we have, that we're passing down.
Now, would addiction result in the same fashion? I mean, is that the same? Would it create the same trauma in that unborn child?
It can, because it's changing the chemistry of the body. So if you have a parent that's on, let's say amphetamines of some kind, well, the body's going to develop a sensitivity to that prenatally that is going to make it more likely for them to need some kind of stimulation. You're going to find a lot of kids whose parents have been heavy marijuana users have the symptoms of ADHD because they need constant stimulus in order to be able to function. So, we have so much of what we do as parents in our society is not done with any kind of intentionality. It's not done with any clarity of thinking. It's not done with clear decision making. We have a whole bunch of really reactive parents, and I'm not judging them. I'm just saying biologically they are in that state, and they are incapable until they can regulate themselves of really doing a good job of parenting. And the real scary part of this is we're already seeing the impact of it. You go back when I was a kid, there weren't any child protective services. If your parent was treating you badly, they were prosecuted under animal protection laws. We had animal protection laws a good 70 years before we had a human protection law.
Protecting our children.
And, when you have a whole society that everything is designed
you know what's crazy? Not to cut you off, Dr. Bob, but you know what's crazy is communist Russia understood that the children was the essential need. Like all the education goes into the children. How do we not? I don't get that. Blows my mind. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that blows my mind.
We don't want to hear it.
That's crazy.
When I have had conversations with groups that I'm presenting to, I get a lot of feedback from the group saying, well, you're just blaming parents. And I'm not blaming anybody. I'm explaining what's going on biologically.
Right.
In order to change
right,
it.
It's science. You can't argue with science. This is science.
No, this is you increase neuroadrenaline, a little bit, and people are going to become more assertive or aggressive or hostile. I mean, that's the correct response if you change that. And so, because we don't like the responses, we tend to blame them and shame people and want to point our finger at them and say they're bad or they're evil or they're sinful. I don't have any value in that. Is there genuine evil out there? I believe there is, but I think no one's genuinely evil unless they are in their executive functioning system and making these choices, and those are usually what you would consider high functioning sociopaths.
Yeah.
And we just don't have that many of those folks. What we're usually blaming people for is the reactive things they do to try to meet a need. And this underpins most addiction and compulsive behavior comes because you don't want to experience something. And I would rather use this drug than feel like I do when I don't use it.
Right.
And so,
or put in the work to correct the behavior, because taking a pill is much easier.
Sure.
You know? Yeah, I'm blown away by that generational thing that you said, because it takes several generations to get back to the point of no error, and that's without one of those generations experiencing the same stress that created the error in the first place. And how often is that going to happen? Yeah. So to me, that sounds like we're just building a pyramid of mental instability in our nation.
Well, I think we're going to see more evidence of dysregulation in the next decade than we've seen in the last 3 or 4, because we're seeing it kind of just becoming a stronger, more large component of our society. But the reality is, governments really can't regulate this. It requires people to choose.
Right.
To be
at the end of the day, I mean, like I tell people, we could sit around and we can blame the prosecutors, we can blame the judges, we can blame the people that tell on us, we can blame whoever we want to blame. But at the end of the day, I made the decisions that I made because of either lack of education, laziness, whatever. But I'm the blame. At the end of the day, I'm the blame, and I have to change that. Dr. Bob, I want you to before we get off, I know you guys have an online course, and I spoke to Ms. Lucy, and Ms. Lucy suggested that I can give my listeners 10% off for your online course if they join in and and mentioned, that they watched the FreeMe podcast. So can you explain a little bit about this course and what it is?
Well, I'm not sure which course she suggested to you, but
is there multiple courses? I guess it's a 10-hour course.
Okay, we have about 30 courses online. It's probably the trauma support specialist, which is what we do a lot for parents and that.
Okay.
And
she gave it to me in the email. I'll put it in the link and description and all that for the appropriate, but.
Well, I'm also going to give you 2 90-minute things. I'm going to put them in the chat right now.
Okay, perfect.
One is on looking at motivation. If you're going to work with people that are traumatized, you have to approach motivating them differently.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have in there the difference between traditional therapy and trauma therapy. It's a huge difference. So, and then the on our YouTube page, which really might be a better fit for your listeners, we actually have an entire 4.5-hour training called "Loving Them Isn't Enough."
I saw that. I got that in my watch list. I'm gonna watch it.
And it's Crystal worked from. Well, she's a great therapist. She was also one of my grad students, so she is kind of grown up with the way we do things. And but it's very, very it's very succinct. It's easy to understand, and it's really designed for parents. So that wouldn't cost them anything. They could just watch that for free. And if we can get the message out and just have people be aware enough to start looking at how can I change, because the natural tendency is anytime we're aroused, we want other people to change. The car, you're driving on the freeway. We've all cut people off unintentionally. We've all done it more than once. But if somebody cuts you off in traffic, we get mad about it. We get afraid. We get mad, and they're the asshole. And the reality is that that's just our failure to manage us.
They're the asshole, even though I'm doing 60 in a 45.
Well, yeah, of course, because they made me afraid, and that's bad. It's you see in all sorts of things. The kid that is kept after school and so he doesn't have a bus home and has to walk home, and he gets home late, and the parents are frantic about what happened to the kid, and they scream and yell at the kid for being late because they're afraid.
Right.
That's one of the challenges we face is how do we keep ourselves in the place of intentionality? Because most adults are not living intentional lives. Most adults are living reactionary lives.
That's true.
And it's hard to teach a child to be intentional if the adult isn't intentional.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. Let me circle back around, because I feel that's very important, especially for young parents. So in that moment when the parent knows that they're emotional and they're, Johnny, what did I tell you about, whatever, this and that, when is it a good time to circle back and really explain to that child so he will understand and he will remember?
Well, when both parties are calm.
When both parties, the next night or however, a couple hours later.
And it could be too, a lot of times parents want to know, why did you do that? And they don't have an answer for that. And what, if you're regulating well, you can direct them in the direction you want them to go. And that's going to be more powerful in creating change than trying to correct behavior.
That's how I learned how to lie at a very young age, was exactly what you said, because I was expected to give an answer I didn't know how to give. And I knew as long as I gave an answer, they would just go away, and
yeah. So, if you want, the truth is, and again, we have a lot of examples of how people can regulate themselves. Dr. Camilla Pica, who's one of our senior staff, has done quite a few, I think 20 or so brief little exercises that are available on our YouTube page. Again, no cost to your consumer, no cost to anybody that wants to look at them. If they want to start learning some skills to how to keep themselves calm. And but the reality is no child is going to outregulate their parent or their caregiver. And so that always makes people uncomfortable when we start saying, because they want to say, well, this kid's doing this and this kid's doing this, and they're doing these kinds of things. And our initial answer is, what's going on in their environment? What are you doing to creating a peaceful, settled environment so that there's no stress? And then they kind of look at you like, well, wait a minute, this isn't my problem. They're doing the behavior.
Right.
Well, no.
What do you mean you're talking about an 8-year-old child? I mean, come on, I know, and I get it with some of the listeners that I have when I speak to them or whatnot, that says, I can't control my child. Okay, well, maybe you can't control your child because you can't control yourself. You are the example for that child, so ask yourself, why is this child out of control?
Yep. It's really funny. I had some parents that were they were raising twin, and at the time they were 9 years old, twin 9-year-olds. And they would say things to the kids and then be yelling at the kids because the kids didn't do it the way that they thought. And so these kids were in constant tension. And there was just a really funny moment. And this is from a therapist point of view, it was a funny moment. So they told the kids to clean up their room. We come back we're going to go shopping. We come back, we want your room clean, and we don't want to see anything on the floor. So
I've heard that a million times.
They left for 2.5 hours. In that 2.5 hours, everything made it out of that bedroom into the front yard, including the carpet and padding.
Oh my goodness.
I call that malicious obedience. But they did exactly as they were told. Well, and of course the parents blew up. Yeah. Because because the kids were being smart asses, right? And I said, well, where have they ever been? How did you teach them to clean up their room? Did you go through and practice? This goes here, and I don't have time to do that. Right. So you basically just wanted them to go do what you wanted them to do without any kind of instruction. Well, they are 9 years old. They should. So again, you never went through any process of training them. You just expected them, and you've always been expecting them to do the things that you want them to do. That doesn't work. With no understanding. Yep. They're just supposed to magically appear in their thoughts and their minds of how to get everything off the floor. That's right. So it's a silly example, but the reality is that they created this situation. Right. And of course, they don't want to accept the responsibility for that because that makes them feel bad. But the reality is the adult must be a intentionally living human being in order to influence kids for the best. How much time each day is important for a parental and a child to spend together? It's going to flex based on the child. Some children are going to need more, some children are going to need less. But how do you know? Well, you kind of have to sense what's going on with that relationship. The thing is that most in our society, most kids are not getting the attention that they need from an adult. What do parents do? You go back, instead of doing things with the kid, they want the kid to go do something else while they do what they need to do. Right. They don't fix meals that way. It's everything. They really, it's kind of like most parents would be better off having a pet because they don't really want a child. They want something to play with them when they want it to play with. They don't want it to make a mess. They don't want it to be too much trouble. They are not really interested in raising another human being. That's absolutely correct. Or they don't know the responsibility behind it, and they just want to have a child because they're lonely. And they want to have, just like you said, you're better off
going and just getting a pet for real, because you're bringing a child into this life that is just going to create chaos, you know,
for both the parent and the child. So
and a whole lot of other people behind that, taxpayers, systems, all of that, you know. It's and that's why I say, you know, when we have, going back to the stat, you say 4% of children today is coming up with ADHD in schools.
Nearly 40%.
Near 40. Oh, I thought you said 4. Nearly 40%. 40. And then, so if you take the stat out of 1 out of every 100 is incarcerated, so that just we know that there is a single family home or some sort of chaotic environment, just in that stat alone. And we know that the average home has 2 children in it. I mean, that's a large portion of your 40% right there.
Well, and again, you might want to read the original ACE study. You can find it on the Center for Disease Control's website. But essentially what they say is 67% of children are being raised in toxic environments.
67%. And that was from the 90s, you said?
Yep.
I guarantee it's probably went up.
Oh, yeah. I don't have any doubt that it is. But
where do you think it's at? 82, 85?
I think it's probably, they did a repeat of it in 2010, and it was only a couple of points higher. But when you're talking about that massive a number, you know, you're talking of 2/3 of your population. That's pretty horrific.
At a rate like that, where would we be in 20 years?
Again, this stuff is being transmitted intergenerationally. So in 20 years, I'm not so worried. In 50 years, I've got some serious worry.
50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Bob, I greatly appreciate this conversation, man. I've been waiting so long for this here, you know.
Well, thank you.
It's been a great conversation. I love the fact that you love the children and you created what you've created for the love of children, you know. I'm doing what I can over here, just trying to raise awareness with, you know, parents that are, yes, they have somebody that's incarcerated or they've been incarcerated themselves. Their, you know, addiction, things of that nature, you know.
Yep.
The belly of the beast is what I like to call it.
Keep at it. We need people doing that.
That's where I'm at, and it's where I relate, you know. So I love all people. I love all humans. I don't discriminate. I don't judge. Everybody needs help. I understand through my own mental trauma, you know, and instability that if I'm this messed up, there's probably a whole lot of people that's just as messed up as I am, you know? So.
Yeah, I think that's the humanity of it, is that this is affecting everybody.
Yeah.
Even if it's not within the walls of your own home, as your children are interacting with these other children, they're going to get glimpses of this. And then as they move into adulthood, who are they going to have relationships with? And this is something we really need to be working hard at. And again, I don't think it's not something a government can regulate. It is really the awareness and the benefits of that awareness really need to be spread far and wide. And we need to be actively doing things to lift people.
Right. Are you spending enough time with your children? Are you making sure that they're heard and understood? You know, are you explaining, you know, events that are going on in your house that you may just write off as frivolous, but, you know, are you checking with your child to see if they were offended by this in any kind of way, you know?
Yeah. And are you modeling your own self-regulation and talking about the benefits of it to the child? Yeah.
The biggest, that was a big thing for me, was constantly that do as I say, not as I do attitude that was constantly around me, which made me rebellious.
Sure.
You know? So,
obviously.
Dr. Bob, again, you take care of yourself, stay safe. You know,
Thank
how's
you.
the COVID out there right now?
About the same as everybody else. Everybody's, trying to stay in and stop spreading it around, but
We just can't do it. We
Well-
just can't do it, man.
FreeMe Podcast.